And a very good morning to you. We're live in London and you're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today here at Midori House, my guests Nina dos Santos and Rainbow Murray will share their views on the week's biggest stories. Good morning, Nina. Busy week?
Quite a busy week. A few elections. Obviously the big one in the UK on Thursday, which saw the Labour Party win a significant landslide. But we've got elections taking place in France today. And also I'm particularly interested in why a row over conscription could actually topple Israel's government. That seems like it's a conversation long overdue that has stoked some ire, and it could now also be coming to a head.
Thank you for that. We will be heading to Marseille as France heads to the polls for the final round of elections.
Hello, this is Mary Fitzgerald, Monocle correspondent in Marseille. I will be bringing news of today's important French elections and giving a sense of the very real mood of trepidation on the ground.
Plus, Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, will be joining us from Merano. It's the 7th of July, 2024, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
So let's bring in today's panellists. I'm joined by Nina dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. A very good morning to you, Nina.
Good morning.
And Rainbow Murray, professor of politics at Queen Mary University of London and a new voice on Monocle on Sunday. A very warm welcome to the studio. How's it going, Rainbow?
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm delighted to have it. Anyone had a busy week this week?
Well, having to choose between Independence Day parties and watching the UK elections was something of a conundrum on Thursday. I managed to fit both in, but, stayed up so late that I don't remember much of it.
Great. That's the spirit. It's been one of those weeks where, you have a lighthouse and it sort of casts its light round. It sort of feels like in election year, and the beam of the elections is all going right around the world. This neck of the woods, the UK and France, very much seems to be in the glare of the elections. And then hopefully in a few weeks' time it'll all calm down.
Oh, I really do hope so. French elections and UK elections are normally each the busiest week of the year for me. They've both come in the same week. I had a birthday this week and I just had to say, I'll celebrate it next year.
Birthday next
No time.
When will you celebrate your birthday? I hope you'll be doing something non-election related.
Next year.
Excellent. Fine, a whole year to wait until the next birthday.
It wasn't a big one.
Oh, OK. Well, we'll try and fill your glass with something a little bit more exciting.
It's a big year for elections, I suppose, right?
It's a big year for elections, exactly.
OK, your big year's next year. Let's head to Merano in Fitzgerald, where Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, is standing by. A very good morning to you, Tyler. Where are you and how are you?
Good morning. I'm very well, Emma. I am in Lana. I'm on the lawns of the very lovely Villa Arnica, which is just around the corner from Merano. It's a stretch of Europe, I think, that you know quite well, because I recall sort of bombing around in a vehicle with you many, many years ago when we sort of first set down in this part of northern Italy, and we did a few broadcasts from here and there.
We did. I remember it is actually a decade since we did sort of set up camp in that neck of the woods. We did move around quite a bit, didn't we? And how is it now?
It is beautiful, but I think like many parts of Europe, certainly Middle Europa, everyone is really trying to dry out a little bit. Now, it's not because people have had a heavy night. It's just it's been waterlogged. So you speak to the hoteliers here, and they just said normally this is a place which comes alive, early May period, etc. And of course all of the gardens. Yes, they are in full bloom, but it just has not been that sort of sunny, amazing balcony of Europe season that people, of course, have been used to. And even when we arrived on Friday, and many people are saying this is like the first stretch of proper sunshine, the first proper sunny day they've seen. But nevertheless, the hoteliers seem generally happy that rooms nevertheless have been full. And of course, this is that stretch of the world, Emma, that that you've got these wonderful hotels. You've got a couple of good books, and pardon me, and of course a very nice Weissburgunder. What more do you need?
Absolutely nothing at all. Actually, that's ticked every bit of my list. Now, you've been helping the Fitzgeraldian hospitality world in the last 24 hours, haven't you?
We have. This was the weekend of what has really become an annual event. It was Monocle Summer Party in Merano, in Obermais, on Dante Strasse, and that was an event that started, goodness, it's almost a decade ago as well, but maybe not quite. But that was, an event which was sort of just spanned the front of our shop. Well, as of last night, we were sort of across 3 or 4 shop fronts. The road was properly blocked, and it was great. People really turning up from all over the world, from Miami, from Bad Gastein, from London, from Dubai. So it was a great event, and just one of those sort of serendipitous moments where you have Monocle readers and listeners from all over the world that get wind of the fact that we're having a small event, and they just show up and they participate, and it was absolutely lovely.
It's lovely to have that slightly, dare I say, slightly hard to get to element of Merano as well. You have to make a bit of an effort to arrive, because there's, you can fly nearish and you can get a train nearish, but there's that sense that when you get there, that actually you're sort of arriving in a rather nice secret place. So when you have people coming over from the likes of Dubai, I mean, what's been their reaction?
I think people, I would say, let's say first and foremost, many of these people, they are repeat customers. They've had a relationship with the region for 15 or 20 years. And you feel also that they want to keep it a bit of a secret. And there is something about coming here, even though the infrastructure is great. You would like the fact, Emma, that our lovely Sophie Grove and her husband Charlie, they flew in via Sardinia and then caught a plane out of Olbia on Sky Alps. And Sky Alps is the small regional carrier. They fly Q400s, but you can fly right into Bolzano Airport, which is, and this is, the area is not served by the same high-speed trains that zip across Italy on the line between Torino and Venice, or from Milan all the way down to Naples and beyond. This is an area which, of course, has good, solid infrastructure, but as you said, there's something about that last 3 kilometers, the trek up the hill, wherever you want to go. You just have to put in a little bit more effort, because there's a component of almost the pilgrimage coming here. It's a little bit like this region's a bit like the sort of the Santiago. Maybe there is actually their own version of the Camino here.
Talking about slightly difficult to get to, I remember we did some broadcasting from atop of a mountain that was only reached by cable car. It was at the Vigilius Mountain Resort. How's that going this year?
Well, that's going very well, and this is the one amazing thing about this region. My goodness, do they love to build. And when they build something, they do it with this enormous sense of pride, but also speed. It's always remarkable that you go through a small village, you see a place under renovation, that's going to sort of take 2 or 3 years, but you're 2 or 3 months later, it's complete. And the last time we sort of blinked, we went up to Vigilius, and it was, of course, it was lovely, and it was wonderful infrastructure. And now they've completely gone and rebuilt the cable car. I'm happy to say the Vigilius Resort is still as lovely and wonderful as it was when it launched almost some 20 years ago now. But I just couldn't believe the quality of workmanship, the patience and the time that went into creating this amazing new, slightly retro brand around this cable car. So yesterday, 15 of us went up to the top of Vigilius, went for a lovely walk, and then we were sitting on the exact same terrace outside the Vigilius Resort, where I recall we were broadcasting and doing a lot of wine tasting.
There was a lot of wine tasting before midday, and there was also a lot of thick cloud. It was wonderful. It had a slightly surreal element to it. Now I know that we're keen on animal stories here on Monocle on Sunday, and you have already sort of flagged up the fact that there is an important animal story that needs to be shared this morning, Tyler.
Well, there is, because during the walk, we sort of passed by this small alpine petting zoo, and there was a small sign, and it was featuring rabbits, sheep, goats, and of course donkeys as well. So how could you not go into this amazing box, Emma, and you could put your €1 in, and you've got this just wonderful sort of beautiful paper cone full of oats and various things that bunnies and goats like to eat. And then you can just sort of go for a walk and sort of chat and look at all of the lovely animals. And this is the amazing thing. They were a little bit timid, but of course once they see you've got sort of the paper cone of treats, they all come storming down. But here's the remarkable thing. I always sort of think of donkeys as being sort of rather sort of docile creatures. And this was interesting as well, because when you mentioned that point about being at that elevation, the poor animals, they're not sure, should they have their winter coat or should they have their summer coat? So the donkeys were a little bit sort of still with a bit of winter fluff on them, but at the same time sort of thinking it's going to get hot down in the valley, some of that's going to blow up, so we sort of have to have our cool sort of summer coat on as well. The key point, though, is that these poor goats, I thought the goats were going to, of course, really sort of be running the show, but as soon as the donkeys would get even, within sort of 3 or 4 meters of the goats would just like tear away, and donkeys are having none of it. They said all the treats in those cones, those are for us. And I wasn't disappointed, but I was slightly surprised how domineering these donkeys were.
This is amazing. I think there's a sort of a whole second program that we've got to find, which is animal watching with our editorial director.
So Sophie as well is in the market for some bunnies too. So also she was actually doing like a bit of a casting up there, thinking what types of rabbits do they need in their garden as well. So it was hugely educational.
Not quite there for a donkey yet. Okay, well thank you very much for the zoological observation. And I do think you should actually have a Monocle guide to petting zoos because you clearly know lots about them. There's also that nice sense of, when you're up there that things take a slightly more honest and obviously the bucolic joys of being atop a mountain, but there are still those days where you are enough away from the hubbub of a city to trust each other, and there's like the idea of an honesty box which comes to the fore here, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something which I think punctuates many villages, even towns, even cities in this part of the world. I think even when people come to Zurich, they're amazed that you can, go past a major grocery store after hours on the weekend, and all of the plants are still out, and all of the soil, the whole garden center is completely open. And if you had a pickup truck, you could go and, of course, empty the whole place if you wanted to. And it's interesting. I was even thinking back a few weeks ago, we were having a conversation because, we run our little Oxen restaurant hotel project, and we leave all of our chairs and tables out in the evening. And some places they do lock their chairs up, many don't, because it's a bit of just a marker of community, the fact that there's this level of trust. We choose to leave everything out, and you choose not to lock it up. Not so much as a challenge, but just as a little bit of a statement of trust and social capital and a belief in humanity. And that was the great thing also on this walk yesterday. There was this great sort of, wooden box, and it was full of jams, and it was full of various preserves and pickles, all neatly stacked, all beautifully branded, and just a small honesty box. There was a price list along the side, sort of laminated, and then you could just go and leave your €5 or €6 or 25 euros, depending how much you wanted to load up your backpack with preserves at the top of Mount Vigilius. And it's just, I love that about this part of the world. And it was interesting, we had some visitors from the Iberian Peninsula, and said that would never fly in their country. That just simply would not happen. But of course, it is something which is very much of this place.
We have to bring ourselves back down to the city world in a little while, because we've got the French elections happening today, and we also have the Olympic countdown. Now, I was in Paris this week, and there was a sense, I'm not quite sure what your perception is, but it's like a village fete that's not quite ready for what's about to hit it.
Exactly, because on one side you have the traffic snarls and all of the problems that are part of contemporary Paris, and then the flip side is you see this deployment of landscape teams, and what I saw last time I was there was just a small detail of petite palm trees being set up alongside bridges and all kinds of hedges and just this most intimate sort of tiny details around the edges of roads and fences, etc. All the dry plants coming out, and then completely new planting coming in. But as you said, at the same time, and as one of my favorite stories, of course, much hype around this new the new subway link to Orly Airport. But a very good story in Le Figaro yesterday saying that it's just not working. And you might have any number of French rail passes, that's fine. But if you come in as a tourist and you think here we go with this very large bell. I thought you were going to hear the very large church bell in the background. I had a story about that. we only got one ding though, Emma, is the fact that it simply doesn't work. So yes, great, there's all of this landscaping and beautification going on. But of course, the other side of it is that some very key things that should be functioning, especially when you're going to be welcoming the world, are not quite there yet.
And there's also the sense that talking to business people in Paris last week, a lot of them were saying, well, we're all shipping out at the end of, in a couple of weeks' time, because not only do people like to sort of flee Paris in at this time of year and in a couple of weeks' time, but also they've all been told that if they're inside certain zones, that its business will be absolutely stifled by the fact that only a few people will have access to areas at a time when actually the tourists need to be there.
Yeah, and there's many question marks. I was talking to people saying, yeah, well, I work in retail, but I'm not sure what pass I need to get to work. Will I be allowed through various security barriers or sort of borders that are going to be erected around the city? And of course, we hear the administration saying yes, that these, of course, it'll all be very clear quite soon. But it is quite soon already. I think that's the big question mark as well, because there is, of course, when you think about the hospitality industry, yes, these people have to, of course, be there to, of course, serve drinks and make sure that the restaurants are up and functioning. But I think a lot of people are wondering how many people are actually going to show up. We were able to secure very good rooms at a very good price only 2 days ago, Emma. And we didn't sort of dig around for many, other rooms for our team, because we've secured a couple of apartments for the radio team that's going to be there. So it's just this question mark. And even you look at some of the bookings as well. I mean, Air France was talking a little bit about, that the bookings through Paris, connections via Paris, people seem to be a little bit scared away. And I think part of it has been this sort of narrative of chaos and what is going to come. But anyway, we're going to hopefully deliver a level of calm. What is it? Is it 3 weeks from today that we're there?
3 weeks today. I think we're on the roof.
We will definitely be on the roof Sunday morning. Very much looking forward to it.
Me too. One thing that I'm hoping I'll let you go in a moment and let you go and enjoy your bucolic bliss. But you're off on holiday this week. What's in the Tyler Brûlé tote?
In the Tyler Brûlé tote. Of course, much reading that one has to catch up on, and just a bit of an easy roadmap down through Lake Garda, Emma, across to a nice little stretch of Liguria. There might be a dip into France as well, and then back through Milan. One more main event this summer, which we'll be doing in Milan on the 16th before Italy breaks for holiday, and then it's going to be back to Zurich, and then I'll be seeing you shortly after. Actually, London before that as well. Seeing you in London, making sure you've packed all of the right things for the Olympics. Is there going to be any headgear aside from obviously earphones and a microphone? But I've sort of been wondering, what are you going to be wearing from your broadcast perch?
Well, headphones, obviously, but I don't know if you remember in 2012, the Spanish team had the best hats when they had the opening ceremony. They were memorable. They had smart red outfits and very, very good straw hats. I'm going to try and secure a good Spanish straw hat.
Okay, listeners, you know where to find Emma Nelson if you've got a spare straw hat. Emma, have a good Sunday.
Thank you, Tyler, and happy holidays. That was our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, up an Alpine Hill. Up an Alp. Good to hear that, there is that sense of trust and sort of like that I've mentioned it twice, that bucolic bliss that you get when you're up a mountain and you're far from civilization. And actually, as I pounded I was just thinking about pounding my sore knees down the London pavement, getting to work this morning, and sort of head down dodging the pigeons, and then just that transformational scene that Tyler has just described to us. It sort of a little bit of longing, a little bit of Sehnsucht there.
Yeah, well, if anybody who's listening to this show hasn't been to Merano, that northeastern corner of Italy right near Austria, where, by the way, they speak German, it is absolutely spectacular. And it has a very, very unusual feeling. It's like a completely different ecosystem that's part of Italy, but feels like it's quite distinct and very professional, as Tyler was just saying before, very sort of shielded, bucolic, but functional. It almost feels more like Switzerland. And I'm glad to hear that the donkey's dressed for the part, because heaven forbid, wearing both your winter and summer coat, with Monocle's editorial director. Trust him to notice that.
Well, it's actually the sartorial choices of donkeys is always something that preoccupies a lot of minds here at Monocle. But it has been, dare I say it, it's been the season for, you're layered beautifully today. I can see you've got at least 3 layers on Rainbow, because we don't know what to do anymore at this precise time in July. Normally at this time of year, a shoulder might be out. But actually, we've got not necessarily the thermals, but, a good jacket's being worn here and there.
Yep, I am well dressed for winter in July. But all that talk about the honesty box, actually, that reminded me of summers past with my in-laws who live in rural Denmark, where people grow their own produce. They grow strawberries, peas, potatoes, and they just leave them in a box outside their house on display with an honesty box. And they assume that no one's going to nick the produce and no one's going to nick the box either. If they want some, they just put some money in the box and take it away. And I did look at that coming from London, where everybody distrusts everybody else. And I thought, what a beautiful way to live.
It's lovely. Did people abide by the rules and regulations? It was just a naturally assumed sense of trust in the community.
Yes, absolutely. I think, in a small community, people know each other, and your reputation, I think, is worth more than whatever you would get from stealing something, so people don't.
I remember there's a little village in Warwickshire in the United Kingdom where there was it's taken the absolute opposite view. Actually, there's not an honesty box, but the man who runs the local newsagents actually writes the name of the people who nick stuff in the window.
Dishonest.
It's like, John Smith, you stole milk last week. Mrs. Jones, you had a packet of Haribo.
Name and shame.
And they absolutely community name and shame. That's taking some, because obviously if you have, if you're Mrs. Jones and your son snaffled a bag of Tang Fastics last Tuesday on his way home from school, then obviously there's it's like being in the stocks. It's incredible.
That must be quite a powerful deterrent.
It is.
Actually.
It's mad.
Having said that, I think obviously we've had a political earthquake in this country, and I think honesty and dishonesty has been very much in the forefront of the electorate's minds, hasn't it?
It's a beautiful segue, Nina dos Santos, to saying how's the political week been? I must confess, I should have stayed up all night and watched. But the election, once the exit poll came out, was such a decisive landslide for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. I just thought, well, everything that needs to be said is going to be said in the first 5 minutes. It's just, it's just that the gravy comes in the middle of the night. Were you an all-nighter on this one,
I
Rainbow?
wasn't. As elections go, that one was not a nail-biter. I think the French election is going to be much more uncertain, and we can come back to that in a bit. But with this one, my fellow academics and I were discussing the finer points of how accurate the prediction polls were, because the actual outcome itself was so decisive and so clear.
It wasn't that far off, actually, was it? Because I think they predicted 410 for the seats for Labour at the exit polls. But actually, they ended up getting even more. I think it was 421 when the dust had settled.
It was 412, last I looked.
412.
I could
maybe a touch of dyspraxia landing in my head.
The point is that it was foreseeable, foreseen, and reasonably accurate. There was more uncertainty, I think, with exactly how the reform seats would fall. So when the exit polls came out, they said potentially 13 seats. But then you had John Curtis explaining, well, maybe, there's quite a few seats where it's down to a few hundred votes, and so depending on exactly how it goes within the constituency, it could be more, could be fewer. It ended up only being 5. I say only.
So John Curtis, for those of us who don't know who Sir John Curtis is, he's the only man in the United Kingdom who knows everything about elections, and they wheel him out.
Senior psophologist of the whole country.
He's absolutely incredible. I think what's interesting now is when we look at the way that Keir Starmer has been positioned, and there's been that sort of uncertainty about what does he stand for, what are his policies, and the whole thing, and the idea that's now being openly discussed, which is that he has been treading incredibly gently in terms of what he's been doing, and the fact that the change that he will implement, or his government intends to implement, will be step by step. And now all the papers this morning, I think the Sunday Times has a commentary saying, OK, Keir Starmer, you got in gently and built up an enormous sort of head of steam behind you, you've now got to come out and say, what do you stand for? Is that an accurate call to action, or do we just trust someone who looks, dare I say it, a little bit boring, sounds a little bit boring, but seems to be a grown-up in a world of total chaos?
I just think the country wanted change, didn't they? After 14 years of Conservative government, during which life expectancies have fallen. Also, income has stagnated for many people. Taxes have risen to the highest level in 70 years. And broadly speaking, Matthew Parris is actually writing this in the Sunday Times as well as a columnist in his last column. He's a former Conservative MP and a famous columnist on the centre-right. I don't agree entirely with what he's saying here, but he said, look, frankly speaking, people were just sick of getting poorer. They were just sick of the fact that they couldn't see any change coming in terms of better expectations and futures for their children and investment. And as a result, they just voted for change. And frankly, he says, it could have been anybody. Who knows? I mean, the big question here is, as we know, Keir Starmer didn't give a huge amount of details on his policies heading into this, partly because he didn't need to. This was viewed more by some people as an election that the Conservatives lost rather than Labour won as a resounding victory. And the pressure's going to be on from him from all sides, including members of his own backbenchers as well, to try and determine exactly how he's going to create this growth that he seems to think is going to be the panacea for, as I was saying before, re-establishing that prosperity and taxation problem that people are so concerned about here, and also the housing crisis too.
It's an interesting collection of people that he's brought into government, because obviously he's had time to do this. I mean, they've been waiting in the wings for a very, very long time. But there seem to be some quite relevant and interesting appointments, don't there? I mean, we have the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who's also, I think she's working on housing as well. Someone has said she is the first person to deal with social housing in the United Kingdom who has actually lived in social housing. We have a new prisons minister who's actually the CEO of a key-cutting firm. Now, the relevance to that is that he hires an awful lot of former offenders, and so he knows how to reform the prison service from within. The Health Secretary openly says he's had kidney cancer, and so has used the NHS absolutely at the coalface. Do you think that will be helpful? Because it will mean that actually, if they don't get it right the first time, then who else can they bring in?
Well, I think this actually links also back to the question about why did Labour win the election and why did the Conservatives lose it? So it is partly the economy, but I think it's also a question of competence. I think the main reason above all else that the Conservatives lost the election was because people no longer had faith in their competence. And the economic pain that has been inflicted was in part attributed to that loss of competence, because people had also recognised we have had some shocks. We have had COVID, we have had Ukraine. Not all of that can be blamed on the government, but it's how they handled it. It's the trust that people had, and people had lost that trust. And so the reason why we had a very, very quiet campaign really from Labour, where they didn't promise much of anything. They knew it was the Conservatives' election to lose. They knew that the one thing they couldn't afford to do was get any question marks over their competence. And generally, the less you say, the fewer gaffes you make. So they just didn't really say anything. But now they're bringing in people who, exactly as you've said, have a bit of a track record in the areas that they're trying to solve. They're trying to say, listen, I can do something about this, because I'm not just some Johnny-come-lately who's done Eton and Oxbridge and then been thrown into a portfolio I know nothing about. I have some competence that I can draw on. And so it's also about, again, building that public trust, about showing the relevance of politicians, and they're not just living in a Westminster bubble, but actually have some clue what they're doing.
Internationally, we have Keir Starmer going to the United States to the NATO meeting. We've already seen a video of him talking to Joe Biden, which I think is we've never seen anything like that before. When we hear the conversation between the Prime Minister and the President of the United States, he's on Air Force One. So we have Keir Starmer having to be an international diplomat straight away, plus the fact that the UK is hosting the European Political Community meeting in 10 days' time. The UK is a recalibrated global UK is straight into the spotlight from tomorrow.
Yes, and one that isn't populist anymore in the way that other countries are potentially pivoting towards populism. So the big question is Is the UK a shining example of how populism, or at least, let's say, a centre-right pandering to populism, centre-right government that's absorbing populist rhetoric, like, for instance, the Rwanda immigration policy and so on and so forth, is this an example of how populism can actually peak and how populations can decide eventually from one moment to the next to just turf it out resoundly and go for something completely different and a more egalitarian left-wing agenda? Who knows? Just to make a segue, though, sorry, another one of my famous segues towards France, Emma, it's interesting, you were just talking, Rainbow, about the issue of competence. And if you look at France now, you've got this potential rejection by people who are seduced by that populist rhetoric of the far right, the rejection of the inarchie, as they call it, of the famous politicians, the mandarins who've been trained in the elite École Nationale d'Administration system, like, for instance, Macron himself, that is no longer gelling with people over there. So we've got France and the UK on diametrically opposed political paths at the moment, it seems.
Neatly said, because we're heading to Marseille right now to get a sense of what is happening on an historic day for France. France heads to the polls for the second and final round of parliamentary elections. Let's hear from Mary Fitzgerald, who's out and about in Marseille. A very good morning to you, Mary.
Good morning, Emma.
You sound like you're out. Have you voted yet?
I cannot actually vote just yet in France. I'm not a naturalized French citizen, but hopefully in the future.
Well, we have Nina dos Santos and Rainbow Murray, both France experts this morning. So let's dive straight in. We are expecting the far right to do very well this weekend, reshaping French politics quite profoundly. How well are we expecting them to do?
Well, I think everybody is pretty much in agreement that what we will see is basically the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's far-right party, become the largest party in the assembly, and that, of course, is historical. That is unprecedented. It's not expected to basically form a majority, and that is because over the last week there has been an effort by the different political parties to basically create what's known in France as the Republican Front, to basically stop the far right making major inroads. So now, today, there's a sense that has worked up to a point, and that will prevent the National Rally from basically getting a majority. But what everybody is sure of is that we're facing into a very, very turbulent period where you have an assembly, a parliament, which is, completely divided. There's talk about what this means constitutionally, the idea of a caretaker technocratic government being necessary. That would be new for France. So really there's a sense that whatever the outcome today, we are really moving into uncharted waters politically. Also, there's a sense, here in Marseille, I've been walking around this morning, some businesses have put up protective barriers on their windows. The same is happening in France. There are concerns that this evening, tomorrow, as the results start coming in, that there may be unrest, there may be confrontations, there may be clashes. But for now, here in Marseille, I'm actually standing at the top of my street where we have a polling station in the local school, and all this morning, the polling stations this morning opened at 8, and there has been a steady long line outside this polling station and other polling stations here in central Marseille. That's a good sign, I think, and that would indicate that at least here in Marseille, which has never voted far right, a very, very diverse city, that basically that idea of a Republican front is kicking in.
It's interesting because I think I read somewhere this week that actually, in contrast to what you've just said, Marseille is ready to embrace the far right in many ways, despite the fact that Marseille has been a sort of a target city for Emmanuel Macron for regeneration and for levelling up.
Yes, politics in Marseille has always been a little complicated, we can say. Macron is obsessed with the city, has great affection for the city, and has tried but struggled to build a political base here. It's really a case of unrequited love. Marseille is really Mélenchon's town. Mélenchon being the leader of France Unbowed, the hard left party in France. He was an MP here for several years. It is true that in recent years, the National Rally has made inroads in the city. I and many others were surprised by the results of the European elections here, where Jordan Bardella of the National Rally got 30%, and Martine Aubry from France, from Mélenchon's party, trailed 9 points behind. Now, the way that was interpreted in Marseille was that there was low turnout because it was the European elections. People are not as engaged with the European elections as they are with national elections. But it caused some worry and questions over whether the far right is finally making inroads in this very, very diverse city.
Let's bring in Rainbow Murray, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and also Professor of Politics focusing on France. I mean, just listening to what Mary is saying, there's just so much uncertainty here.
There really is. This is probably the most important parliamentary election that France has had, certainly in decades. And the result remains very uncertain, not just in terms of which party is going to end up with the most seats, but what government is going to form afterwards. Because the likelihood is, as she correctly said, that the far right will get the most seats, but they're probably not going to be in a position to form a government. Their leader, Jordan Bardella, has already previously said that without a majority, he doesn't want to be a minority government. He knows that the rest of Parliament will be against him and he won't be able to get anything done. And he's aware that that's not going to help the party's fortunes. But the question then is, if not them, who else? And the problem that Macron has is that he has consistently positioned himself not only against the far right, but also against the far left. But his potential coalition partners, if he wanted to form an alternative government to the far right, would be this newly formed left-wing party, the New Popular Front. And the problem there is that the left-wing moderates that he wanted to work with have joined forces with the far left that he cannot work with. So what he has to figure out now is, can he disaggregate this new left-wing grouping? Can he persuade the moderates to separate from the far left and come with him? Because without the far left, he probably doesn't have the numbers. And with the far left, he cannot govern because he's pitted them as extreme as the far right. It's very complicated.
Nina?
Well, and also what's interesting is that some of his biggest former political allies, big names like Édouard Philippe, the mayor of Le Havre, the city in the west of France, who Emmanuel Macron basically ostracized because he was threatened by his popularity. He said that he doesn't want to play ball in this potential coalition if, of course, the far left is involved, and refused to stand down candidates. Even the finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, has expressed real scepticism about this possibility of joining up with the left, because he says that essentially it would unravel all of the achievements that previous years of Macron governments have achieved, like, for instance, that controversial pension reform that was something that so many French presidents have tried to enact. Finally, Macron's government got it through, although it was extremely unpopular, raising the retirement age from 60 to 64. So a leftist alliance, which would be, as you were just saying before, Rainbow, dominated by lots of this far-left ideology, could unpick a lot of what Macron's achieved just 2-3 years before the end of his presidency.
One always knew that the minute he got any kind of pension reform through in France, that would effectively be his death warrant.
Any
Mary,
president.
Just building on what we've been talking about a little bit here in the United Kingdom, that the sense very much here is that in the elections that happened earlier at the end of last week, that it was an election that the Conservatives lost, not necessarily where Labour triumphed because of who they were. Can you sort of compare that a little bit to what's happening in France at the moment? Is there a real sense that people are attaching themselves to the National Rally? Still hard not to say National Front. It's very strange. Or is it people who are so dissatisfied with what's with their lot at the moment that they just want to give Emmanuel Macron a second kicking after the European parliamentary elections?
I think there is some of that sentiment here. There have been a number of interviews with prominent figures in recent weeks that have actually unsettled many, I think, because it shows that there's a shift happening in terms of, the National Rally, once known as you said, as the National Front, which was utterly, utterly toxic in French politics, now becoming not only mainstream, but also just in some circles, even respectable. And one interview I was really struck by was a recent TV interview by Matthew Kassovitz, who's the director of La Haine, the film in the late 1990s about the banlieue in Paris and racism and the challenges in the banlieue. And he gave an interview where he very controversially said, well, maybe the National Rally could do a better job of governing France than the other political parties. Maybe it's time to try them. So that's kind of indicative of a shift in mood here, where people who would once have utterly condemned the National Rally and the far right are softening their tone. And I think that that's something that many others find really worrying, and where that shift may take us. Yesterday, I was at the Rencontre Économique in Aix-en-Provence, just down the road from Marseille, gathering of big ideas, kind of gathering every year, bringing the great and the good from Paris. And it was interesting because Peter Mandelson, of course, the architect of New Labour, was speaking on a panel in the final plenary, and he was talking about lessons, basically, from the British election. And what I find fascinating, because, of course, this issue has been to the fore, right at the top of the discussion here in France as well, he said those on the left, those in the progressive space, need to have a new conversation on immigration. He made the point that several elections now throughout Europe have shown that this is a key issue, and he said it's time for a new conversation. And I thought that was really, really interesting. He got a lot of applause. So it was interesting in terms of where we're going to see that and other conversations go here in France in the future.
Actually, we've seen an article written by the former Prime Minister Tony Blair in the Sunday Times today, writing a letter to Sir Keir Starmer, the new UK Prime Minister, saying you have to get a grip on the immigration narrative. But Mary, do we know exactly what the National Rally really stand for? Because we've talked so long about the detoxification of the party. We've seen Marine Le Pen firing her own father, changing the name. But at the same time, there are still those characters, and there is still that sort of undercurrent that we have admirers of Putin, we have racists, we have admittedly repentant Holocaust deniers that are being written about at the moment. And if they do come into power, do we know what they will try and do?
Well, this is exactly the question. You know, going back to what Nina was saying, yes, there is a lot of concern about what a hard left government might do in terms of rolling back economic reforms, et cetera, et cetera. But others are countering that by basically saying, well, yes, the hard left is this, we know that, but the far right is what it always has been, even if it's tried to kind of soften its face. And one of the issues over the last weeks here that has caused a lot of concern across France is Bardella has talked about the question of binationals, so people who have dual citizenship here in France, and a pushback against people of dual citizenship that could manifest itself in many ways. And one of the proposals they have is that basically dual nationals would not be able to hold certain jobs in France, in government, in the defense and security establishment, etc. And this has prompted a rather extraordinary, public show by French diplomats who have been tweeting over the last week, including Karim Amalal, who's Macron's ambassador for the Mediterranean, basically talking about how they are proudly binational and they are proud to serve France, and they would not be able to serve France under a far-right government. So that shows how the pushback against these ideas that are not new when it comes to the National Rally or its predecessor, the pushback against those ideas that many in France consider very, very dangerous and much more dangerous than, say, a rolling back of economic reforms.
And the interesting thing there, Mary, is that Jordan Bardella, who's widely tipped to try have a tilt at being Prime Minister in the next couple of weeks, he is the son of an Italian immigrant.
Yes, indeed, and he's also a child of the banlieue. He likes to kind of talk about all of this to kind of burnish his credentials and say, you see, I'm not a typical kind of extreme right. There have also been stories in the French media in recent weeks about one of his grandparents being originally from Algeria. So it shows the kind of complicated family stories behind a lot of this. But in many ways, he has tried to kind of twist that story to say, I'm not what you think the far right is, and this idea that we're different. It's not the racist, bigoted National Front of the past, but there are many who say they are basically a wolf in sheep's clothing now, and they remain what they always were, which is this xenophobic racist party.
Mary Fitzgerald in Marseille, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle on Sunday. Nina, your reaction to that? I think it's the results come out at 2000 local time, don't they? And I mean, for starters, the French do a live political show like no one else on earth. I mean, they do the best set.
Filmed.
They are so beautiful to watch, even if you don't understand a word. I get everybody just watch it. They're just so stylishly done. They know how to put on a news show.
That's right, and learn from the lighting. Look, I'm going to borrow a line from Mathieu Kassowitz's famous film La Haine, which I remember watching as a student in the French lycée in London in the 90s. C'est pas la chute qui compte, c'est l'atterrissage, which means it's not the fall that counts, it's where you land. And I think that's basically going to be the message of the night. If the far right gets the biggest share of the vote, the most seats, it's going to clamour for more and more power and more dominance over the political debate from France. And I think there's just no way back from that. That trend is kind of set in motion now, and we might see it crystallised this evening, even if we see this Republican front of centrists and leftists pushing back against that. The trend is kind of very much in that direction. And it is significant, I think, as Mary Fitzgerald was just pointing out before, that you have key figures in the entertainment world now perhaps talking about the potential of far-right government, quote-unquote, not being that bad. The counter-argument, of course, is that France is still playing in the Euros, and people like Kylian Mbappe and some of his teammates are still talking out about not voting for extremes.
Indeed. I mean, we were watching the football a couple of nights ago with some French friends, and I said, hang on a minute, this is a country that's just about to go very far right, and yet if you look at the makeup of the French team, how many of those are the children of immigrants? And our friend said, yeah, when they win, they're French. When they don't win, it's a different problem. And it just that sort of summed up the great cultural crisis that France seems to be having at the moment, although that is something that's criticism that can be levied at lots of countries.
Yeah, I mean, I've been... apologies to my fellow English people, but I've been cheering on the French team in the European Championships, precisely because their legitimacy seems to be based on how well they do. But I know that as long as the French team are winning, their messages about safeguarding against the extremes are more likely to land. But it is difficult to know how best to counter the far right. Some people feel that the best way to do it is through this Republican front that we've been talking about to try and minimise their chances. But there's been some pushback against that as well. Some people have said, well, if you're standing down other candidates to concentrate the vote against the far right, then you are depriving us of what we chose as an electorate. If we want to vote the far right, you've got to give us the far right and stop getting in our way. And I think that there was some understanding of that with Macron. I think he wanted to block the far right. He wanted to keep himself in power. So that was the plan A. But I think the plan B, if that didn't work out, was maybe, just maybe, we let the far right come into government, give them 3 years, they'll make a mess of it. That will take all the wind out of their sails, and then that will make it much harder for Marine Le Pen to win the presidential election in 2027, because that's what they've really got their eyes on. That's where the real power lies. So I think he's also thinking maybe we just give them a rope to hang themselves with.
We are living, Nina, aren't we, in a world of political gambles being played by very young and very old presidents. I mean, let's depart from the French elections. I think we'll hear plenty of that for the next while. But we've had a week where we've had obviously people saying Emmanuel Macron gambled something phenomenal. He gambled almost France's fate in a sort of like an explosive gesture 4 weeks ago after the European parliamentary elections. Joe Biden seems to be gambling everything by refusing to step aside, but also the American press are gambling everything by calling for his departure.
Well, they've changed their tune now, particularly the Democratic-leaning press, who I personally felt were fawning a little bit around this subject for quite a number of months. And, have to answer to that, let's face it, because it's been quite apparent that Joe Biden is getting older at the speed of knots. And now we've seen with this terrible debate performance and then subsequent disastrous interview with George Stephanopoulos that didn't, by the way, another former Democratic operative, that didn't, assuage people's fears about the president having potentially cognitive decline and just not being fit for being the next leader of the most important economy and democracy in the world for the next few years to come. So the big question really is whether or not they can get donors to try and talk him down to put forward another candidate. But it could be too late in the game at this stage to find somebody who's well known enough that people would vote for, that they can sort of create a persona around.
What is it about politicians when you get to the stage, Rainbow, and you studying this and teaching this all constantly? It's almost like watching a Shakespeare play. They always do one thing that suddenly unpicks years and years and years of strong efforts. And we've seen that with Macron. We're seeing it with Biden. Arguably, they saw it with Tony Blair with the decision to go to war in Iraq. It's the one thing that they make that one fatal mistake. We're also almost go back to a Greek tragedy now. Why do people keep doing this?
Well, first of all, because everybody's human. And people will make mistakes. Also because the kind of person that goes into power, by definition, has a pretty large ego. Most of us don't wake up in the morning and think, I should rule the world, or at the very least, I should rule my country.
Thank God not.
And the self-belief and the self-promotion that it takes to get into that position requires a certain mentality that can then lead you to dig your heels in a bit. And we've seen people, once they're in power, they don't really like to relinquish it. And I think that with Biden, it's possible that he doesn't actually realise how badly he's doing. It's also possible that he is concerned that anyone who takes over from him now is not going to be strong enough in that amount of time to be able to defeat Trump. But what he perhaps doesn't appreciate is that every single day that people are talking about his competence, and going back to what we were talking about earlier, people will want more than anything else, more than honesty, more than experience, they want competence. If people are doubting his competence, and if people who are his friends, the party donors, actually people elected within the party, people in Congress, if they are doubting his capacity to govern, then there's nowhere to go from that. That is the story. Then he's lost no matter what he does. So I think they really need to get on top of this, and they need to do it soon.
It's interesting. I was on a radio panel show on Thursday evening, the day of the UK elections, and we were discussing exactly this subject. Why won't Biden give up? And many members of the panel thought that it was 48 hours he had left to, stand down. Then it was 96 hours, and still we don't have an answer.
Still going.
81 years old and still going strong as a president and potential presidential candidate. But I think the other thing is just it's disappointing for the United States, isn't it? Because essentially you've got two old white men from privileged backgrounds as the only option that Americans will have to vote for, really, here. And successive polls have shown that they don't want Trump and they don't want Biden as either candidate, that essentially it might be time for a woman, female presidential candidate. We've tried that one before and it hasn't worked. Maybe if somebody like Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, might eventually be elevated, take over from Biden at this Democratic National Congress and be the next candidate, she could end up being the first female president of the United States without it being a woman issue on the ticket.
But they've had a long-standing problem in America with the idea of a woman president. We saw the amount of misogyny and vitriol that got hurled at Hillary Clinton's direction. But I've looked at this subject over time. It wasn't a Hillary thing. It was a problem with women in American politics thing. And I think that the Democratic Party is also aware of that and wary of it. They've also got problems with race. So while people might be looking at someone like Kamala Harris and saying, well, why don't people let her step up? She's the obvious person. I think there's also a wariness of exposing the party to that level of misogyny and racism, and whether that would also cost them the election.
Do you think Gretchen Whitmer might end up taking over from Joe Biden as the candidate at this point? Is she the likeliest?
Well, first of all, we need Joe Biden to stand down, don't we? I think that's the first question, but that's also part of the problem, that there isn't a single obvious front runner that everyone could unite around. They're running out of time. How do they organise some kind of nomination process when we're already into July and the election's in November, and ensure that it's someone who can unite the party and unite the country? Let's
move on to a final subject that you wanted to bring in, Rainbow, from not necessarily your absolute immediate colleagues at Queen Mary University of London, because you're in the politics department, I'm assuming. Yes. Music department has been doing some work. I love the fact that you've brought something in from your parish. That's quite nice. So Champion, it's a story that on initial glancing you just think, why have they actually even bothered to do this? Tell us what it is. Tell us what the story is.
Okay, well, the story suggests that melodies in music have become less complex over time. And so the tunes that people were composing in the 1950s and 1960s were more complex and sophisticated than the ones that have been produced in more recent generations. And so there was a decline in complexity in the 1990s when rave music came along. That's perhaps not a huge surprise, that they tend to be built around a repetitive beat. And now we're seeing another wave of a decline in complexity. But it's also worth saying that for the most recent songs, it's not necessarily that the song as a whole has become less sophisticated. It's perhaps that there's more in the backing track rather than in the vocals. You don't really get the kind of barbershop quartet harmonies that you used to get.
And what's caused this? Is it because our musicians are less skilled, or our ears are thicker?
I don't think it's either. I think it's partly that we've now got better opportunity for composing a backing beat to a song, that we're no longer as reliant on live instruments. You've got more of a sort of computerization of it. But I also think it depends as much as anything on the artist. I mean, I grew up listening to 60s music, and just to be clear, I'm not a child of the 60s. My mum is a child of the 60s, but I listened to her music constantly because that was the soundtrack that I grew up with. And you had these incredible harmonies of people singing together as a multi-track, and now you get much more of an emphasis, I think, on vocal solos, and then everything else is the sort of the big beat that goes around it. And you have more people, I think, ghostwriting for others now rather than people composing their own music.
Nina, are you a sort of 1960s harmonies, or are you a big beat girl?
I was reading this article, full disclosure, on the bus on my way in, listening to Sabrina Carpenter's famous Espresso tune, which I think was the subject of one big US magazine's whole sort of piece about, why is it so popular? It's largely because, as you were pointing out before, Rainbow, that it's essentially simplistic and quite repetitive, but that's what's catchy about it. Obviously, this is a trend that's going to continue with the advent of AI, but I just wonder whether it has a lot to do with the fact that we're all multitasking. Our lives are so consumed by so many different layers of busyness and complexity that actually when we seek solace in music, we want something simpler than before. I don't know.
It's funny that we've got shorter attention spans now.
Quite, yes.
And it's funny, my son plays around and makes an awful lot of music online. And what he does is, in 5 scant minutes, he can pull together something that I would probably stand up and have a little bit of a move to on a dance floor a while ago. But there's that idea that he can instantly create a rave classic simply by just pulling stuff off the internet. It's quite astonishing, isn't it? I wonder whether there is that sort of, not saying he's not talented, but finding a track online is slightly easier than actually composing everything himself.
Arguably, and you could say it's a sort of a democratisation of music as well, in that it's perhaps easier to compose a tune, but actually getting something to go viral, to get people to listen to it. Sometimes something that is very simple and very catchy will take on faster than something that is more complex and sophisticated.
And also I suspect that the music industry, the commercialisation of music nowadays has changed radically since the 1960s, hasn't it? I mean, you look at Taylor Swift, and essentially she herself and her music is a product, perhaps even more, she's more of a product than her music in terms of sort of marketable, brandable sort of asset. And as a result, I think that probably affects the type of music that we make, right?
We'll have to leave it there. My thanks to my guests in the studio, Nino dos Santos and Rainbow Murray, Mary Fitzgerald in Marseille, Tyler Brûlé in Merano. The programme was produced and studio engineered by Mariella Bevan. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday returns next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.